All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Barbara Lopez-Coons, and I'm the Chief Executive of DIA, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning in this lovely building. Hope everyone who has never been in the centers of U.S. government appreciate the opportunity to get into two of the most important buildings over the last couple of days. So I'm going to kick off our first panel of this morning, and I'm going to talk about with a number of key panelists, this topic of next generation innovations in regulatory science. So that topic wove through much of what we talked about yesterday. If you think about the full conversation, it came up over and over again. And we're going to use the next hour and a half to really dig into this topic of innovations in regulatory science. So let me start by taking you back a few years. It probably is in most of our personal experiences that perhaps over 10 years ago or so, there was a lot in the media about what was happening in regulatory science, and there were conversations around the brain drain and the drug lag and issues around regulation and regulatory review that was really, those issues were getting in the way of getting medicines to patients. And over the last many years, there has been a very significant change in the practice of regulatory science, as we've all seen. But the real question is up here on the screen, and this is the question that our panelists are going to endeavor to address. So do you believe that the science of medicines development and the science of regulation are progressing at an acceptable pace to ensure safe, effective, and accessible products are getting to patients? So just to think about that question for a minute, let's go back a bit and talk about what's actually happened over the last few years. If you go back to the start of the Human Genome Project, and just as a point of information, October 1st marked the 25th anniversary of the initiation of the Human Genome Project. And those of you who've been in this world of medicine will remember that over the last few years, that $3 billion budget generated something like $800 billion of economic output. That's based on a 2013 study. How did that come about? It came about in terms of new medicines, new industries, new instruments, et cetera. The whole industries evolved because of the investment that the US government with other world governments made in understanding the human genome. So you come forward and you look at where we are today. And as a result of that, the understanding that we have, and we heard yesterday about personalized and precision medicine, the understanding that we have collectively about disease progression has really increased. And so that understanding has generated an incredible amount of biomedical research and biomedical science. If you look at the Human Genome Project, even thinking about some of the sub-elements of the project, the mapping chromosome 22 was a big international effort. 8 countries' governments were involved. The health research organizations of 8 countries' governments were involved in that. And I'm here to say that I think that the evolution of regulatory science is going to require a similar kind of international collaboration. So let's talk now about the outcome of all of the medicines development that has been going on over the last several years. If you look at what's in the works today, pharma has published that there are more than 7,000 medicines in development globally today. And if you look at those 7,000 medicines, the question is, are we really addressing the total global burden of disease? And in fact, in March of 2015 at the EMA 20th Anniversary Conference in London, Dr. Alias Zerhouni, who's president of Sanofi Research, was quoted as saying, "At the end of the day, the diseases where I see approvals coming through affect less than 20% of the population." So there's 80% that is not being addressed by the research that's being done today. But you can see the distribution on this slide of the various diseases that are being researched. So let's now move to regulatory science. And regulatory science obviously is critical for ensuring that those medicines are being developed and brought to patients and ensuring that the safety and efficacy of those products is intact. Back in 2011, Margaret Hamburg said, "Today we are neither effectively translating scientific discoveries into therapies, nor fully applying knowledge to ensure the safety of food and medical products. We must bring 21st century approaches to 21st century products and problems." And so the big question is, with all that avalanche of science to create all those medical products and the investment that we've made in regulatory science, are we in line? Or do we have a 20th century regulatory system and a 21st century biomedical product system? So if you look at this slide, this shows you with the various agencies around the world the improvement that has been made, and you can see that there has been significant improvement in accelerating medical products through the review process. And many of the agencies around the world have done phenomenal things. So if I can just tell you a few. The European Medicines Agency announced adaptive licensing as a pilot project on the 19th of March, building upon the priority review process that was already in place. The US FDA has 4 distinct approaches to accelerate review: fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review designation. And I won't go into any of those details. I'll let the experts talk about that. In Japan, in 2014, half of the new substances that were approved benefited from priority review. And Health Canada has a priority review process in place which has really helped to accelerate drugs for life-threatening or severely debilitating conditions. So we've seen that countries' governments have done a lot to try to accelerate the review process. So I want to start a conversation around this big topic about medicines development, the burden of disease, and whether or not the regulatory science is really helping to bring the whole equation together. And most importantly, I want to also introduce the patient's perspective as I close my comments. And I'm going to steal a quote from one of our panelists, Alistair Kent, who was quoted as saying, "Patients and their families want to be part of the process which determines the safety and efficacy of new medicines. Patient input to regulatory decisions will help to ensure the flexibility necessary to weigh risks and benefits appropriately and secure speedy access to worthwhile interventions that will enhance the lives of those with serious and life-threatening diseases." And so with that, I want to invite each of our panelists to come up and make some opening comments. What we will do then after their comments, I will open the floor to a panel discussion. I invite you to think about the questions that you might have for the panelists, and we'll take it from there. So if I can ask Carol Linden. Oh, let me introduce the panelists before I do that. Sorry about that. On our panel today, we have representation from regulatory, from industry, from academia, and from patient groups. We have Hans-Georg Eichler representing EMA, and most of you have heard Hans yesterday in our session. We also have Carol Linden here from the US FDA. She's the director of the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation. And unfortunately, Rob Califf had to back out at the last minute because of a scheduling conflict, and Carol was kind enough to agree to stand in for Rob. We have Sandra Milligan here on our panel today, Senior Vice President, Head of Global Regulatory Affairs for Merck. She'll be taking the global industry perspective. I should also add that Sandy is the chair of the board of DIA, and I'm delighted that she is so dedicated to this topic and devotes her time to DIA to help me and the group of the board and staff of DIA do what we do every day. We have Alistair Kent, director of the Genetic Alliance, and he'll take the patient view, and then Gigi Hirsch, who's here from MIT NEWDIGS, and she'll take a very interesting view around the systems engineering approach to this whole complex topic that I've just been talking about. So if I can hand over to Carol, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much, and I apologize that Rob couldn't be here, and I hope I can do the speaking position justice on his behalf. So I'll speak about the future of regulatory science at the FDA. As Barbara said, I'm the director of the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation. Just to give you a little orientation, my office reports to the Office of the Chief Scientist, which reports to the Commissioner. So I'm in the sort of headquarters component, if you will, of the FDA, as opposed to being in one of the regulatory centers. So FDA has its own definition of regulatory science, which has been discussed and debated periodically, but this is the definition that we use for conversation: the science of developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess the safety, efficacy, quality, and performance of the products that we regulate. Back in 2007, some of you will remember this probably better than I because I wasn't at the FDA at that time. The FDA Science Board, which is a group of external non-government advisors, subject matter experts, published a report called FDA Science and Mission at Risk. And in that report, they raised serious concerns regarding the scientific enterprise at the time at the FDA and identified several causes for what they believed to be a deficient scientific enterprise. The causes were underfunding, brain drain, where people had left and lost a lot of scientific expertise from the organization, and increasing legislative mandates and responsibilities in the absence of increasing resources to support them. Since 2007, the agency has also been bestowed with additional responsibilities in several different pieces of legislation. Again, I think several of you in the room are very familiar with some or all of these. I'm not going to read through them. And we have one pending at the moment, the potential for a piece of legislation to be passed called either 21st Century Cures, which is the House version of the language, or the Senate Innovation Act, both of which would contain a number of provisions and mandates for the FDA to accelerate product development and approval and enhance regulatory science. So the recommendations from that 2007 report included three major ones listed here. The first, to realign the science organization within the agency to strengthen the science base and to enhance the scientific workforce. In response to that recommendation, FDA established the Office of the Chief Scientist. Now, right now, Dr. Stephen Ostroff is the acting commissioner of the FDA. He came to be acting from the position of being the chief scientist. And Dr. Luciana Borio is currently the acting chief scientist. So for those of you who are familiar with those offices or those people, that's what's going on with them at the moment. So the Office of the Chief Scientist was established, and underneath that is my office, the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation, and several other offices. One you might be more familiar with, and the others could be the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats, which deals with the CBRN threats, and Dr. Lou Borio's real position is the director of that office, and she took the lead for the agency on all of the Ebola issues, so you may be familiar with her in that context. And the office also manages the Senior Science Council, which includes all of the senior science advisors to the center directors from across FDA, and this has been a very valuable organizational entity in which to coordinate and collaborate across the agency. We published the report Advancing Regulatory Science at FDA, and it's blurry on here. I can't read it, and I can't remember if it's 2012 or 2013. But FDA published their strategic plan for advancing regulatory science, which includes the 9 major goals that are listed here. Again, none of these are a surprise: to modernize toxicology, stimulate innovation in clinical evaluations and personalized medicine, support new approaches in product manufacturing and quality. We're all familiar with the challenges that 3D printing or additive manufacturing present to the regulatory entities of all of the countries. Ensure FDA readiness to evaluate innovative technologies. Harness diverse data, big data, and information sciences, a huge challenge for us, especially in conjunction with personalized medicine and being able to manage all the data that's going to go along with that. Implement a prevention-focused food safety system, absolutely critical, again, a global issue given the supply chain for food throughout the world. Develop medical countermeasures, that goes to the CBRN threat space. develop social and behavioral sciences or strengthen social and behavioral sciences. How can we get people to do things to improve their health, those things that are under their control? And strengthen global product safety. Those of you who interacted with Dr. Peggy Hamburg when she was the commissioner know that that was one of her key priorities. I want to note that there are other offices of regulatory science throughout FDA. There's an Office of Regulatory Science in just about every center and in the Office of Regulatory Affairs. And I just mention that because I get a lot of phone calls for people looking for the Office of Regulatory Science, and it's not me. But all of these centers have their own program and product-specific regulatory science programs, and we include both intramural and extramural support in our activities. In addition, out of my office, we have some centers of excellence in regulatory science and innovation in academia. We have 4 centers. Other centers at FDA have extramural centers of excellence also, particularly the Center for Drugs and Center for Foods and Applied Nutrition. The Critical Path Initiative lives throughout the centers. It used to be managed centrally, but it is now distributed. We asked the Science Board to review the progress that we've made. Excuse me. We asked the Science Board to review the progress that we made since their 2007 report and asked them the questions that are listed here. In addition to asking them to evaluate us in order to help them do that, we published a report which was released in July of this year at the Science Writers Forum called Science Moving Forward, which outlined our progress and, in our view, that we've made since 2007 and gives examples of activities in each of the 9 regulatory science theme areas. The report that was just released by the Science Board is titled Mission Possible: How FDA Can Move at the Speed of Science, and basically acknowledges that the FDA has made considerable progress since 2007, that we've responded to the recommendations made in that 2007 report, but that there are many issues and challenges that lie ahead of us. The key recommendations from this recent report, Mission Possible, include the following. Look at medical product innovation to facilitate biomarker and surrogate endpoint qualification. There's a lot of discussion about focusing on increasing and improving the efficiency of clinical trials through master protocols and different statistical approaches to clinical trial design. Data mining and analytical tools. They acknowledge that the Sentinel project has been very successful and would like to see us expand that to other product areas. Genomics, huge issue for personalized and individualized medicine, as well as in the foodborne and outbreak investigation arena. We have a robust effort within the agency on nanotechnology, looking at methods and standards and manufacturing issues for any products that include nanotechnology approaches, as well as for novel technologies for lab and field analytics. Modernizing toxicology is a worldwide effort which we are engaged in, and there were several recommendations made in the report in that context. And the report also asks us to expand our extramural collaborations. It specifically mentions the Reagan-Udall Foundation, and there are many recommendations in there with regard to fostering and developing our 21st century workforce. As a government agency, we're subject to all of the constraints of the various personnel systems, which can sometimes not match up with our ambitions in terms of who we'd like to hire and how we'd like to train and develop them. And last but not least, they call upon our Congress and our administrations, current and future, to allocate resources necessary to match the responsibilities that the agency has. So the overarching regulatory science priority for medical products is stated on this slide out of the report: to support the development of innovative ways, basically bigger, better, faster, stronger, to speed medical product availability without having a negative impact on product efficacy or safety. Additional priority areas that they called out are listed here on the slide. Again, patient-focused product development, which is something that's going on right now, and the social and behavioral sciences. I'm going to end with this slide. Dr. Ostroff, our acting commissioner, attended this conference, which was held, I believe, in September in Parma, Italy, the Global Summit on Regulatory Science, which had representation from 26 countries and over 100 participants, and fostered a great discussion on increasing opportunities for regulatory science internationally. We do have an Office of International Affairs. I asked them to make me a little bit smarter on what we do internationally, but a lot of it is not so much, I think, in the science arena, but more in the regulatory side of things. But this conference that we participate in annually is a great forum for exchange of information on the regulatory science aspects of the products that we're all interested in. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Carol. I'd like to now invite Hans-Jörg Eichler to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning. Barbara said, let's have a conversation of regulatory science. And I always wondered myself, what is that? Is that the emperor's new clothes? Is anything new here? And a colleague of mine in academia said, oh, I see, there is good science, and then what you do is regulatory science. Well, let's hope that's not true. What I want to contribute to the conversation is illustrate 3 levels where regulatory science should come in and give you 3 very concrete examples. So the basic level, the bare minimum is, as you hinted in your introduction, is regulation and assessment should not stand in the way of the progress of science. And here is the example. You know that taking benefit-risk decisions is more an art than a science. So you assess everything, and in the end, someone says, yeah, I think the benefits outweigh the risks, and someone else says, no, I don't think so. That's pretty much just sort of eyeballing things. There are people who think we can do better, and they develop methodologies. One of these methodologies is called MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis. Now, the point is not whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, not for discussion today. But what happened to us is one of the major companies submitted a dossier to us, and at the very end, they had the results of an MCDA model in there. So our assessors see that, and guess what their knee-jerk reaction is? We don't know what that is. That's not how we do it here. Let's chuck it out. So fortunately, that was then mitigated. It was like that in the first assessment report, but then other people came in and said, well, maybe we want to rephrase that slightly. So that is unacceptable. If our assessors say, I disagree with your assessment because I take issue with the weightings of this and how you come to these conclusions, that's all fine. But to say we don't know what that is, that should never happen. So that's the bare minimum. Don't stand in the way of progress. The next level up for me is, we have a problem on hand. Can regulatory science help us address it? And I have a great example for that, and I hinted at it yesterday. So in 2009, we had what was then called swine flu pandemic. Everybody was vaccinated. Halfway into that, there were stories that in Northern Europe, only in Northern Europe, there were cases of narcolepsy. Many of you will not know what that is. Suffice it to say, you don't want your child to have it. So, first, oh my God, is that another scare like the autism, or is it true? But it solidified. Sort of, some point in time, we said, yeah, maybe a true signal. But then why only Northern Europe? Why not everywhere else? And that was easy to sort out because Northern Europe had made different purchasing agreements than the rest of the world. Everybody had different vaccines. But why don't you see it in Southern Europe, not in Canada, not in the US? And the most interesting story was, why did you not see that in Canada? Because the Canadians used a vaccine that was ostensibly the same manufacturer, should have been the same. And particularly in Quebec, no signal from there. So is it that the Quebecians have a lousy surveillance system, or is there a true absence? So someone in Quebec looked at the data very closely, and it came out that there is a genuine absence of signal. Why? So someone else took commercial samples from Canada and from Northern Europe, took them back into the lab, and while they should and did a battery of immunology tests. And lo and behold, they look very different. So one is manufactured in Europe, the other is manufactured in Canada, but they behave differently when exposed to certain antigens, to T cells, etc. Very different. So the first hypothesis that was gone out, because we had that, it's the adjuvant in that vaccine. No, it's not, because the adjuvant was the same. What is very clear is the antigen is different. So now came in the protein scientists, and they looked at the sequence of the protein, and what is the structure, the three-dimensional structure of the epitope. And it turned out that this is different for some reasons. We still don't know why. Is it a mutation in the egg, because it's produced in eggs, so the virus could mutate? Or is it something else? We don't know. But it's clear that it is the epitope. And then someone came in from bioinformatics and said, wait a minute, that epitope has the same structure, or very similar, as a protein in your brain. So could that be molecular mimicry? What that means is, I inject you with an antigen, your body produces an antibody, and that antibody, by pure bad luck, also cross-reacts with something in your body and damages it. And that may have happened in the brains of these young people. That is the current hypothesis. So, do we know exactly what's going on? No, not yet. But the more important thing is, can we use that learning to avoid it come up next time and design out a sequence like that out of the production, so that next time when it comes around, we will not see that problem. So, to me, it's an unfolding case. We still are only halfway into that. But that is a prime example of regulatory science where you have signal detection, epidemiology, immunology, bioinformatics, protein chemistry, and hopefully, in the end, vaccine manufacturing, and hopefully a dose of common sense. So this is how you can address a problem that's already there. But the top level, so to speak, is anticipate a problem that will come around so that you can facilitate the next generation of molecules coming to market. And my favorite example, and I used it also yesterday, is this idea that in future we will have drug combinations. A couple of weeks ago, an umbrella trial was published where you took patients with different cancers, all had the same mutations. That was the BRAF mutation. And we know that in patients with BRAF mutation, a certain of those, and melanoma, that drug clearly works. The miracle is short-lived, as we have heard yesterday, but there's no doubt that it works. It does something. In some of the other cancers, it did not, or maybe very little. We don't really know. So how will you now generate the evidence in those little subgroups? By way of big, old, randomized control trial? No, can't work. So we need new ways to look at that. And what will you do once you found that in one tumor type, it may have a bit of an effect or not? Do we really need to know that? Or do we have to have a decision rule, what comes now? Should we combine that molecule with something else? Because we like to believe it does engage and modulate the target, but it doesn't translate into a clinical effect. So how now can we use those molecules that maybe failed, quote unquote, in one tumor type in another setting? So defining those decision rules, defining how you declare efficacy has been shown or not, that is the next generation of regulatory science questions. So I hope these examples can usefully contribute to our debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans-Georg. Very interesting comments from the regulator perspective that I'm sure are going to stimulate a good discussion. So let's hear from Sandy Milligan how industry sees this topic.
Thank you. I don't have any slides today. I thought I would just talk. And as you know, sometimes coming from industry, I get to be the lightning rod for many, many comments that might be coming my way. But I wanted to pick up on the definition of regulatory science. And it's very interesting. I lead a regulatory organization at Merck. And oftentimes I'm asked about regulatory science and how would I define regulatory science. And I tell my staff that I don't think of regulatory science as something that's developed under a microscope. And I don't find regulatory science as something that's coming out of clinical trials or the clinical data. I really find regulatory science as being developed by the collaboration of multiple stakeholders, including patients, industry, agencies, legislative bodies, and physicians, of course, and the scientists. But it's something that we're moving together forward with. It's not something, again, in a textbook, you can't teach it, but it is around that collaboration and innovation as we all pull together in the same direction to progress science and get therapies and access to therapies to our patients. There was two areas I wanted to touch on just briefly, and it's not really in the innovative space, it's in the innovative science space rather. What I wanted to highlight is I think that we also need to apply regulatory science to our manufacturing processes. And it did come up in the FDA presentation. Thank you, Carol. And it is really important. And I know, not being in industry, it's hard to really understand where I'm moving from this, but the manufacturing process and supply chain is so complex to actually get our medicines to patients. I'll give you an example. At one of my companies, the way products are put together, there's the product substance, there's packaging, there's labeling, and as you can imagine, even the labeling is different country by country by country. Just translations cause incredible challenges for the companies to get their products to people. And in one of my companies, the distance that the drug substance traveled from the manufacturer to the patient was the same distance as going to the moon and back. That's how complex the manufacturing chain was. There would be a piece of the substance that would be manufactured in one plant. There'd be another part of the molecule product manufactured in another plant. There was another plant where the two pieces came together, or six pieces came together, and they put it all together to put into one drug. And then that drug moved to another manufacturing plant to be packaged, and then, of course, got disseminated to be distributed. So with the CMC, there are a lot of innovations that are ongoing, some of it around a concept called continuous manufacturing, or how do we actually get a plant to have multiple supply chains and supply lines coming through that manufacturing plant. But it is one area where I think an increased investment in regulatory science and collaboration would really improve the access to the drugs and the speed of the access to the drugs to the patients. So I just wanted to highlight that as one area that might be of interest and maybe a topic for conversation. The second area that we touched on briefly in the prior presentations was around globalness. Again, this is a challenge that's unique to industry, or not unique to my industry, but it is really forefront to my day-to-day activities. Getting my drugs approved, or getting the updates to safety labeling approved, getting the efficacy into the label to allow the access, getting the products registered to market, it is complex, as you can imagine. We're fortunate enough to work with our first nations, if you will, our first countries, the US, Canada, Japan, China, the EU, very, very good, skilled at making sure that we get our drugs to patients in a timely and expeditious manner. And they're very forethought of the scientific principles that they want to apply to some of the endpoints and clinical trial design that we have. The rest of the world isn't quite as fortunate, and we find the drug regulation really lagging, and so the concept of regulatory science isn't always prominent in some of the other countries. And what you find is, it's probably not as transparent to many of you, is that, I don't want to call it a drug lag so much, but the time that it takes to get drugs out to the rest of the world to improve the public health overall, worldwide, it really is a critical issue that I'd like to see more collaboration and more idea generation as we continue to move forward with regulatory science, how we can improve access globally. So when I think of regulatory science, I just want to emphasize, I really think it is a collaborative science. It's an innovative science, it's a collaborative science. I also want to advocate not to forget industry in the discussion, and I think most people do include industry, but industry does have a very strong part to play. We are scientific, we are ethical, and we try to bring the drugs to the patients as fast as we can. So I'm just going to close there so we can get to everybody else, and then we'll be ready for the panel.
Thank you, Sandy. Alistair, can we hear from your perspective, please?
Well, good morning, everybody, and I'm pleased to be here to be able to give you a patient perspective on this question of regulatory science. Now, a patient perspective is something that should concern each and every one of you, because unless you happen to drop dead on your way out this afternoon, and I hope very dearly that none of you do, you will all be patients. So you will all have an interest in the effective intervention of innovative healthcare products which will be delivered to you in order to address your unmet health needs. So getting the framework right from a patient perspective, I think, is crucial. And it's clear that there must be a regulatory framework. We absolutely do need a way of controlling what people are allowed to bring to market to address our healthcare needs. You must all have heard the stories of families, usually with sick and dying children, who go to desperate lengths in order to raise the money to take their child to the Kim Il-sung School of Stem Cell Therapy in Pyongyang or somewhere. And it never works. You know, it's a disaster, it's a tragedy. So that's why we need regulation. But the regulation we need must be appropriate, it must be proportionate, and it must be fit for purpose. Patients want timely access to effective medicines. Let me tell you, as a patient, I have no interest in medicines that don't work. I just don't want them. What I do want, though, is to be part of the decision-making process that helps me to understand the potential benefit that comes from an intervention and the risks that might be associated with taking it. Patients, we all know there's no such thing as a perfectly safe medicine. And we all know that if you regulate to ensure that everything we might take is perfectly safe, we will end up taking nothing. And that's not an acceptable outcome either. But what we want to do is to have a say in the determination of the outcomes that you're seeking to address with respect to our conditions that matter to us. Give you an example. In Europe, we've recently licensed a drug for treating a certain subset of boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. One of the measures that was used to determine the effectiveness of the drug was the 6-minute walk test, which many of you will be familiar with. And that's long been understood, it's validated and what have you. But if you ask the boys and the parents of the boys with Duchenne, what they say is really important to them is not so much the moment at which they go off their feet, which this drug is designed to delay, because there are alternatives. And often for boys, the moment when they transition to a wheelchair can actually be more liberating than trying to stagger on, almost literally, in walking. What's much more important is the ability to keep their hand function going, to keep their voice strong, because that's what enables them to interact with the world around them and maintains their quality of life. But hand function was not part of the outcome measures used to determine that whether or not the particular drug should receive a license. It's also important that we create a regulatory framework that permits sustainable engagement in high-quality biomedical R&D. Despite the enormous progress that we've seen in the last 50 years, sadly it's still the case that most diseases remain intractable or incurable. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And we need a regulatory framework that will encourage that development and where people can see, in a sense, that the hurdles over which you have to leap are fit for purpose and can deliver information to clinicians, to healthcare systems, and importantly to patients and families in ways that they can use and understand. Now, we heard yesterday from a number of speakers how the cost of conventional routes to drug development are becoming unsustainable. So we need to find a new framework in establishing clinical effectiveness and also fair pricing. As a patient, I have no particular problem with a high price for an innovative drug if that's a fair price, if it reflects the investment that has been made, if it reflects the ingenuity that has been applied, if it brings cutting-edge concepts, into mainstream clinical medicine, and it's been a difficult and expensive process, and it only addresses a small population, then fair enough. It should command a respectable price for it. But we need to have the transparency in the pricing system that allows us to understand that, yeah, we are paying a high price, but that price is reasonable. We also need to move to a situation. Sometimes I think that regulatory institutions, national competent authorities, would really rather, instead of expecting their regulation to reflect the biology that the intervention was targeted to address, they would really rather if they could create a situation where our biology was expected to obey the laws that we create, which is actually a much more challenging problem than getting down getting down and dirty with the biology. So we need to think of new ways in which we can address the increasing awareness we have about the importance of tackling rare diseases, of the way in which personalized medicine will influence the sort of approaches we take to identifying targets for drugs, and so on. The traditional phase 1, 2, 3 marketing authorization, post-marketing surveillance, etc. route may still work for some products, but it won't work for many of the products which we see coming through the pipeline. And the other thing we need to do when we're looking at innovation is to codify what we mean by evidence. You know, you start with small populations, but you know, we had some discussion yesterday about the subjectivity of patient-driven outcome measures. Well, you know, at some point, anecdote becomes a trend, becomes evidence of effectiveness, and is able to inform utility and clinical practice. So, you know, but if you simply dismiss, oh, well, that's just anecdote, you never find your way in to picking up that important information. We've seen some important advances. We mentioned the MAPS pilot at the European Medicines Agency, the Adaptive Pathways approach. In the UK, we've got an early access scheme, which is designed to bring promising interventions into use with patients quickly so that you can generate the real-world data. We need to find new ways of evaluating those. We also need to find ways of continuing the... Sorry, I thought it was... We need to find new ways of continuing the process of evaluation through the decision made by the regulator to the decisions made by the HTA authorities and the pricing and reimbursement bodies. So you've got a seamless web with patient input to all of those stages. In the UK, we've developed a system for evaluating highly specialized technologies, which are expensive interventions designed to address complex needs of very small patient populations, as opposed to populations of very small patients, I suppose, but where patient input is a central element of that process. Patients reporting on the impact of the condition on their lives, the things they can and they can't do, the way in which the possibility of intervening might change things for them, so that the other elements in the equation, the other players who come to make the decision, can contribute their bits too. In Scotland, they have a different mechanism, a committee called PACE, which stands for Patient and Clinical Expertise, which again allows for that input from end users into the decision. But the important thing is to make sure that you ask patients the right questions to enable them to make their input. It's no use asking me what size of clinical trial you need to generate the statistical power to reach a conclusion about safety. Haven't got a clue. You tell me you use Bayesian statistics or Boolean algebra or examine the entrails of a dead chicken to find that number, and I'd probably believe you. But I do know about how the disease will impact on me. I do know about how my life is limited by having a condition. I do know the elements of that condition that matter to me and which I'd really rather like you to address. as compared to those elements of my disease that, well, they're a nuisance, sure, but I can live with them. And it would be nice if they weren't there, but it's not so important. So essentially, I think what we need to try and do when we're looking at creating a regulatory framework is to make sure that it's permissive rather than inhibitory. We don't want a situation where the default position is no, when you don't look at what the costs of doing nothing might be. You know, it's not as if you refuse the license for an innovative intervention, that everything in my world remains rosy. You know, I still live with the consequences of an unmet medical need if you decide that it's not appropriate to let it through for me to benefit from. Now, if I think that the system is fit for purpose, then I won't like it if you say no, but at least I will feel that I've had a fair crack of the whip and a say in the decision that's being made, and I think that's important. I think it's also important to review what we've done and to modify in the light of experience. Again, give you an example here. In 2007, the European Commission, European Union introduced the Advanced Therapy Medicinal Product Regulations. Since then, the CAT, the Committee for Advanced Therapies at the Medicines Agency, has approved 5 products. If you look at what's going on in the world of gene therapy, of stem cell biology, of tissue engineering, it's seething with excitement. There are fantastic developments going on, but these are not coming through. You know, all credit to the Commission for trying to create an anticipatory framework, but it hasn't. What the framework has done, in my view, is to create perverse incentives for academics to try and go round the system, because the procedure, the standards, the understanding of what's required have proved too difficult for innovators, for entrepreneurs, for academics to engage with the process of commercialization appropriately. You know, and if you've got a system that creates perverse incentives to force people around it, then A, there's probably something wrong with the system, and B, it's acting as a barrier rather than an incentive to bring innovative therapies to the benefit of patients. The answer, though, is not to say, well, you can't use the hospital exemption. We'll just stamp that out. We'll close it down. Nobody's allowed to do anything unless it goes through a centralized procedure. The answer is to look at how the hospital exemption is being used and how we can bring that evidence in to the regulatory framework so these exciting and innovative products can be commercialized. Hans Georg raised the question about regulatory science. That term raises my eyebrows as well, not because I don't think science is important in regulation, but I think it tries to kind of interject certainty into what is, in effect, a process for managing the social contract between society and the innovators, the drug developers, the technology inventors, to manage the risk of bringing forward benefits for patients and consumers. It allows for the confidence of a system that is driven by probity to be maintained, but at the end of the day, it's a social judgment as much as it's a scientific one. Scientific techniques, scientific decisions can help inform. But at the end of the day, as Hans Georg says, you know, you sit there and you look at the risk and you look at the benefit, and it's supported by all sorts of evidence and that, but someone has to say go or no go. So it's a societal decision as much as it's a social decision. And getting it right is more important now than it's ever been, because we've got more possibilities now than we've ever had. You know, we've got the developments coming out of genomics. We've got bioinformatics. We've got the contribution that imaging and other new technologies can make. We've got huge possibilities from science, things like mitochondrial transfer, stem cell therapies, and so on. So the challenge for the regulators is to keep up with the change. And the challenge is also to integrate the process across the different sectors. So there is a coherent message about diagnostics, about devices, about medicines, and about clinical practice. So we get all the elements of high quality healthcare working together in a seamless way that means that I can be confident that my clinical care is based on good science applied in a timely, a user-friendly, an appropriate, a proportionate, and an effective way, so that I can benefit from the skill and creativity, from the enthusiasm and the hard work that you all bring to the party in response to my as yet unmet needs. So thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Very appropriate tee up for Gigi as the final speaker. And Gigi, I have the slide.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be representing the academic perspective. I think it'll be considered a very non-traditional academic perspective, though. I'm wearing the hat of the executive director of the NEWDIGS program at MIT, which is a global multi-stakeholder pre-competitive consortium. And I'd like to start with this image. There is no greater mistake than to try to leap a chasm in 2 jumps. I think that this represents a fundamental philosophy that drives us in NEWDIGS, that siloed, incremental, and fragmented innovation just isn't going to get us where we need to go anymore. We've been hearing a lot about the need for collaboration. That's been a central theme of the last day. And that's certainly important now to collaborate for that bridge, but it's also very important for the future. We need to be thinking about this as a sustainable enterprise here. I was very excited to find this picture of a really cool bridge. This bridge was the winning bridge design in an international competition in the field of road ecology, where apparently a central risk that has to be managed there is to prevent roadkill. So this bridge is a really interesting one, and I think it embodies a lot of the fundamental principles we need to be thinking about as we move forward to figure out what our bridge to the future looks like. So this bridge is made up of flexible, dynamic, modular materials. They're affordable, they're repurposed, they're reliable. The red in that picture is not a special effect. That red is very intentional and it's used for targeted communications. The red makes it easy for humans to know where to cross, and the red is invisible to the wildlife, so it doesn't disrupt their environment. And what I thought was really interesting was that the bridge materials have embedded sensors in them that are continuously monitoring the movements of the people and the animals with an eye towards fully expecting to need to modify those crossing options over time, but in ways that are informed by evidence. The evidence about what's happening with the different wildlife species and how to better reduce the risk of collisions. So I love that picture. Very excited. So what does our bridge to the future look like? And Hans-Georg, we can't thank you enough for this slide because it's been showing up in almost every presentation so far. The idea of what needs to happen in this transition to the future. And that is, we need to move from what we call magic moments or binary moments to lifespan management, and a number of other coordinated evolutionary innovations that are going to span everything from pre-market to post-market. Every stakeholder has to be involved in this evolution or it's not going to work. And most importantly, these changes have to be connected. They cannot be done in fragmented ways or we're not going to be able to build that bridge. The heart of the matter, whether we're talking about adaptive biomedical innovation as a broad umbrella term or regulatory science innovation, which is a critical component of this evolution, the heart of the matter is this is science-driven, this is evidence-driven, and it's about evidence versus access trade-offs and how the various stakeholders make that decision. How do they weigh those options? And there are many moving parts to this now. This regulatory science innovation, a truly thriving landscape. There's a lot happening. It's a very exciting time in innovation. There are innovations happening in all three of those buckets: evidence, access, and decision making. Don't need to walk through them. Many of these have been mentioned over the past day. There's a tremendous amount happening on the evidence side with tools and infrastructures. The Sentinel Initiative, Jeff Brown is here today, that fantastic development. Mobile apps, umbrella basket trials, platform trials, study designs and analytic methods, moving towards rapid cycle analytics and moving from RCTs only to integrated evidence, a huge jump that we need to make because we're not in the world of average patients anymore. That's not what it's all about. It's about variability and how we manage variability and drive more value for patients because of that variability, but it has to also be sustainable and acceptable to all of the stakeholders. We've got to do this together. There are all kinds of policy innovations happening around the world that we've heard about, whether it's breakthrough in the US, whether it's adaptive pathways in Europe, Vanessa's law in Canada that Brian knows about, regenerative medicine law in Japan, and even on the decision-making side with engaging patients better, patient preferences, improvements in benefit-risk assessment frameworks. So it's not that there's a paucity of innovation happening by any means in this space of regulatory science innovation. The challenge, though, is not necessarily what we're doing, but it's how we do it and how we take these innovations and implement them into practice. And unfortunately, the regulators are often caught between a rock and a hard place on this. And I just think of it as success being in the eye of the beholder, how we apply these innovations as we move forward. Peggy Hamburg saying, there are only two speeds of approval, too fast and too slow. Another quote that was making the headlines a couple of years ago, not all FDA approvals are created equal, raising a question of, is flexible decision-making a good thing or a bad thing? There was an academic paper that came out saying, look, the quality of clinical trial evidence used by the FDA, it's different across different indications. And Peggy's saying, well, of course. People are different, diseases are different, drugs are different. So flexibility should be, in theory, a good thing. And a comment from Janet Woodcock, a very compelling statement that was made in a commentary about our paper that came out of NEWDIGS, our first paper on adaptive licensing back in 2012. Her comment was, the wider medical community will need to be willing to embrace the explicit trade-offs between evidence generation and access. Very true. So we think in NEWDIGS that we need some process innovation here. How do we take these innovations and implement them into practice in a way that moves the needle for patients in meaningful ways, but is also acceptable to all the stakeholders, because that's what it's going to take. So NEWDIGS is a safe haven incubator environment. MIT serves as the neutral intermediary hosting this collaboration. It's very global. It's very multi-stakeholder. These are some of the folks who are on the journey with us so far. Not all of them. It's not a comprehensive list. And we welcome new people all the time. It's a growing and thriving platform for collaboration. But as one of the faculty members at MIT said to me the other day, he says, okay, I get it. The old academic way sometimes doesn't work. We need to be collaborating. I can get anybody you want into a room, but then when they get there, I don't know what to do with them. This is something we haven't talked about on this theme of collaboration. Yes, in theory, collaboration, absolutely essential. It's not that easy to do sometimes. What do you actually do at ground level in terms of collaborating and making it productive? This is how we approach it in NEWDIGS. We have a program under the skillful leadership of Mark Trusheim, who you all heard speak yesterday, under the name of the Janus program, Janus being the Roman god of beginnings and transitions, who looks forward to the future and backwards, as do we, with prospective and retrospective case studies. We want to take conceptual discussions and bring them down to ground level. We've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to work with sponsors who have been willing to use our pre-competitive environment in a way that would have been unthinkable 5 to 10 years ago, and that is that they actually come in and bring in proprietary data from actual products in their R&D pipeline. These are live assets being developed now, anywhere from preclinical to late phase 2. And we do an in-depth case study with all the stakeholders at the table. Sorry. Thank you. We look very specifically throughout the life cycle of a product at what are the decisions that that stakeholder needs to make, what are the questions that need to be answered for them to feel comfortable making that decision, and what's the evidence that's going to be required to get them where they need to go with that decision. We have all the stakeholders at the table, and the underlying theme here is that we have to move the needle for the patient, but it has to be acceptable to all the stakeholders. That's the rules of the game. And we've been using a methodology we call our scenario design methodology, which we've written up. It's purely a qualitative methodology so far. We've applied it to 13 different products across a broad range of therapeutic areas. And now we're beginning to recognize the importance of having some capability to do integrated quantitative analytics to help support some of the issues. Sometimes you can only get so far in thinking about the trade-off options, that having some quantitative analytics to help with that would be useful, and that's what we're working on now. We're very grateful to NICE for their help so far in working with us on this. Many others have contributed, and we hope that many of you will contact us after this session and say you'd like to work with us as well. My final slide, so getting back to the notion of regulatory science innovation, we think that adaptive biomedical innovation as a broader context for regulatory science innovation is very important for connecting it across the lifespan of a product, for connecting it with all the stakeholders, and most importantly, for making sure that whatever we innovate, when it's implemented in a way that moves the needle for the patients and is acceptable to all the stakeholders together. So that's our story from NEWDIGS.
Thank you, Gigi. I'd like to ask the panelists to all join me up here in the front of the room. And I know all of you have lots of questions because as I was standing up here, I have a lot. And I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to start, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And I know there are people running around with microphones. So, such an interesting set of perspectives. I want to start by picking up on something that Gigi just said, and it was really around, we're talking about collaboration, and through the presentations, it really was firm in my mind that this is a big problem. And I want to hear everybody's perspective on the question, are we doing enough? Do we understand, what the priorities are across this whole landscape in order to make the steps in the right direction to get the improvements that we need? So I'll start with you, Sandy. Do you think we're doing enough as a healthcare products ecosystem?
I think we could always do more. I think that, as mentioned just previously, in just the number of industry collaborations, from my own perspective, has been amazing. To your point about people bringing their assets to the table. For one of our products, a checkpoint inhibitor in oncology, we have over 30 collaborations going on with other companies. 10 years ago, that would be unheard of. You held on to your assets, you held on to that information, you didn't share, right? Because that was the reward, was not to share. I think now on the industry, the science development side, we're finding relationships in industry with academic centers, with the governing bodies. There's interactions attributed there. I actually think that we're well on our way. There's always areas that we can do more. I think some of the new platforms, Transcelerate, CTTI, and the US and globally, they've really been an example of where we can move forward faster. Again, looking forward to a Chatham House rules sort of environment where industry sponsors, patients, legislators, governing bodies can come in and have that dialogue without fear of reprisal, if you will.
Thank you. I'm going to turn over to the regulators now and ask the same question. I don't know which of you would like to go first, but do you feel we're doing enough?
I think we can always do more, and I think we're trying to do more. From the standpoint of a U.S. government agency, the avenues that we have been using and exploring really fall into the arena of public-private partnerships. And what I've learned in my relatively short time at the FDA is that, we are bounded by a number of constraints in terms of our interactions, but through the appropriate types of public-private partnerships that are structured in a way to not misrepresent an influence on the regulatory agency, I think we are able to interact with the whole arena of stakeholders, with academia, with industry, with patient interest groups, and so forth. And we're looking to become smarter about how to do that as we go forward.
Comments on Gary?
Well, I totally agree with you. I think we have made great strides on the science side, but where we are a bit lagging is perhaps the legal aspects of these collaborations. You said the constraints. That is a very polite language for saying we're not allowed to talk to each other and we don't want to. We just started a new project under the IMI, and guess what we spent the first 2 months on? No science, just legal documents. So I think it's that part that we need to bring forward.
Excellent.
Only 2 months.
Well, it was a little more, actually.
I mean, obviously, there's been huge progress in terms of the concept of collaboration. But I mean, I think it's important. I want to think about collaboration in a slightly different light, and that's the collaboration with patients. And I think it's important to recognize that patient expertise is a scarce and a precious resource. I mean, patients are the only involuntary partners in this process. We don't choose to have, life-limiting diseases just to give you something interesting to study, And our lives are taken up by the fact that we have these conditions and that they impose constraints on us in ways that people who are not similarly affected don't experience. So when you want us to make an input for something, remember, we've got our lives to get through that, possibly, at the end of the day, the last thing I or the families who belong to the groups that I represent want to sit down and do is read through a kind of 80-page clinical trial protocol and check that it's got appropriate engagement for patients in. I think if you want to boost patient collaboration, then you have to make sure that you use their expertise, you use their enthusiasm and their insights to answer the questions that they should sensibly be asked to answer. And that way you will add value to what you do and ensure that the patients feel that their input is valued and respected as well. Don't expect them to use time and energy and often resource to do things which can be better done by other people.
So I'm going to shift for Gigi, and I'm going to ask you a question about risk. Because when I was thinking about the process, the MAPS process, I mean, that inherently introduces a level of risk that obviously as a system we need to take on. So how do you see this topic of risk evolving in this ever-increasing litigious kind of society that we live in? And what do we need to put in place across the entire group of stakeholders to get everybody a bit more comfortable with the risks that are inherent in the system?
I guess I would say, first of all, the current gold standard has inherent risks that we often don't talk about. Sometimes I think that if the public were aware of how much uncertainty there was still at the time of an approval for a product in terms of how that product would perform in the real world, that they would be very surprised about that. So I think MAPS, or adaptive pathways, is a way by bringing the stakeholders together earlier in the life cycle and iteratively across the life cycle as evidence is emerging, is a way of sharing risk and uncertainty together. And I think that's going to become increasingly important as we are taking new science and all of these new innovations. Any innovation has risk associated with it. But we can't let that stop us from figuring out how to use it, how to drive value from it. So working together to share that risk and developing processes that makes that as easy as possible for all of us to participate in that. That's really a core competency that we need to develop. And that's what I think MAPS and adaptive pathways represents, a structured process for doing that.
Great. Hans-Georg?
So you say risks. When I think about that and how we can make progress, I always think of the poorly designed movie theater. I don't know whether you know that story. There's a movie theater that was poorly designed by the architect, and therefore the people sitting in the back can get a very bad view only of the screen. So they're all sitting and nobody has a really good view. Until someone there in the back has a smart idea, he's inconsiderate but smart, and he just stands up. Now he has a perfect view of the screen. But he does that, and a moment later someone else, of course, sees that and has the same idea. And then someone else, until at the end, everybody is standing. They again have a poor view of the screen, but now they're more uncomfortable. That is exactly what we are doing, what we have done. Now, how can you remedy the situation? If one of you says, well, I will sit down, you see nothing, because you see only the backs of people standing in front of you. It can only work if everybody sits down at the same time. And that is what we are facing with the changes we try to do. If we do the changes, we are accused of lowering the standards. If the industry does it, they are not compliant. If patients do it, they're sometimes accused of being in the pocket of industry. Payers don't want to do it because it's taxpayers' money. So we can only solve that if we all sit down together at the same time. That is the challenge.
So let me pick up on that, and I'm going to open it to the audience after this one final question. Are the regulators doing enough to stand up or sit down together?
Well, we always stand.
I know there are organizations underway to try to get more global cooperation and collaboration. Could you comment a little bit on what the various regulatory authorities are doing to open up the discussion and try to make it easier to get a little bit more coordinated, if that's the right language?
I am unable to speak knowledgeably about that, except to say that I know it's going on through various different government fora.
Okay. Thank you. I think what I'll do then is, did you want to say anything about Hans-Georg before I open to the floor?
Well, so I can only speak from our perspective as a European regulator. So we have two sort of levels where we have to sit down together. One is the international regulatory agreement, because whenever you people allow something on the market and we don't, we're both criticized. You are too permissive, we are too restrictive, or the other way around. Otherwise, yeah, of course. So at least we have to understand what we're doing. That is one level where we all have to sit down together. But for us, there is an other, and it's across decision makers. So it's us, it's those who decide after us, that is the health technology assessment bodies, those who look at it from a more financial, it's the payers, and necessarily it's the patient organizations. So that, what I would call vertical integration, is what we need to achieve.
Yes, agreed. Okay.
Richard Barker from CASME. This isn't working. Richard Barker from CASME, and declaring an interest, a sort of a UK, European equivalent of what Gigi is trying to do at MIT. Barbara, this is a fascinating session. It was really good, and it illustrates the breadth of the disciplines that are involved in regulatory science. But I go back to the question that we've been asked to address: do you believe the science of medicine's development and science regulation are progressing at an acceptable pace? And my answer to that is no, by a large margin, actually. I think people are being polite about this, because we're trying to manage a situation where change is happening from the science lab onwards and clinical development at a rate that none of us can really keep up with. At the same time, we're discovering the relevance of the social sciences to all this. Economics, behavioral science, law has been mentioned, ethics has been mentioned. And if I look at the amount of investment on both sides of the Atlantic in not just the science of medicine's development, but the science of regulation, it's a tiny fraction of what we spend on the process itself. We're spending hundreds of billions on developing new medicines, And you could say the same for devices and diagnostics. But I think if you added up the people who are working on this problem actively, it's a handful. So if I'm right, and the answer to that question is no, what do we do about it?
Richard, I'm glad you mentioned the social science and the importance of the social sciences in this, because very often, when you ask patients about, what matters to them about access to therapies, it's not just the physical benefits that come from taking an innovative drug or whatever. It's also the psychological and the societal impact that it has, that not only do they feel better in their bodies, they're able to do more and get out more and engage more and, lead a more normal life. It seems, I don't quite understand why, well, I do understand, I'm just pretending to be stupid here, why economics has come to dominate the discussion around the benefits of introducing an intervention. I mean, economics has rightly been called the dismal science. I apologize to any economists in here, it's your fault. But, other things need to be brought into the equation as well. And I think we do need to have that sustained engagement in, researching what works and why and how we can use it.
Any other comments? Okay.
Nobody's got any ideas about what to do about it, by the sound of it. I mean, if we need substantially greater investment in this area, where's it going to come from? Who's going to fund it? Where is it going to be placed? Or are we going to continue to pretend that we can tackle these problems through workshops of experts coming together for a day and talking about it and then going away?
Hi, Jessica Scott, JSK. Thank you for great presentations. My question is about patients. We've talked about collaboration and the importance of having patient involvement in many different ways. And it's been very focused on therapeutic areas and patients knowledgeable about their disease process because they have an illness or a disease. But the general public are all patients. How do we best move them along in this journey? Is it enough to just involve patients by therapeutic area? In the era of increasing transparency in the EU clinical trial regulation, there'll be a lot of transparency around clinical trials. How do we pull them along? What do we need to do from your perspectives?
Who would like to begin?
I think we need to be more transparent and more robust about the nature of the relationships we build. The way in which information about scientific advance is communicated to the public is generally through the media, which have often a very poor understanding and an axe to grind. Anybody who thinks that the media's job is to inform has missed the point entirely. The media's job is to entertain, because that's what sells column inches, generates advertising revenue, and brings the cash in. So we need, I think, to be very robust about the relationships that are developed. We need to stand up as patients and say, look, this level of risk is acceptable to somebody in my situation because I get this level of benefit out of it. We need to engage in partnership with the HTA bodies to defend their ability to carry out a fair process. We might criticize them about some elements of that process, but it's probably much more likely to guarantee that good things will get through than going back to postcode lottery type mechanisms where you depend on what was available when your doctor qualified from medical school as a resource. I think we must get off the back foot and be more assertive in the benefits of the relationships that we build in order to have a proper public debate about, the affordability, the opportunity, the necessity of creating effective interventions for unmet needs.
Sandy?
If I could add, it's interesting about the patient input. I think we're still in the infancy of trying to understand what patient input really is. Is there a science of patient input? Is there a methodology in the way we collect the information? Is there scientific principles that we need to apply once we have that information? How do we interpret that information? And then, of course, once we interpret that information, what do we do with that information? So I think there's an interesting developing science. It will take years to develop that science. I don't think it's instantaneous. I think we're still in the very early stage. I think what we can do is maybe get better at the art, right? The benefit-risk art. And that seems to be where the patient input right now might be where it's the loudest, right? What is that? If someone's just thumb up or thumb down, a little bit of qualitative, quantitative assessment, maybe that patient input, while we're developing the science of patient input, maybe that's where the patients are important right now, that art, if you will, of how we decide which medicines get released to the broader public.
Gigi?
Just a couple comments on it. I think, again, it's hard to talk about these things conceptually in the big scheme of things because it's hard to know what you can do. Within the NEWDIGS program, having an incubator platform, there are a couple things that we're doing. First of all, we are starting to engage our social scientists more. There's a lot that's known that could be brought to bear on this. And to Richard's point, it's very hard to get that funded. So we try to figure out every which way of engaging our social scientist colleagues to do this. The second thing is that in our Janus platform, one of the things that we're looking at is beginning to develop tools, visualization tools, that can be helpful to allow patients to engage in the dialogue in a really substantive way. So in some ways almost democratizing or making the tools and communications more intuitive. So then I have to be an expert, but giving them a mechanism by which they can enter into the dialogue, and their input then gets integrated into the multi-stakeholder integrated analytics. But the visualization tools, I think, are going to be really powerful, and we will want to work very closely with the patients to design those tools to make sure that they are intuitive.
Great. Thank you. Other questions? Stella?
Hi, Stella Blackburn, Quintiles. All this collaboration is fantastic, and I think it's absolutely the way forward and an important way forward that we've got. But are we perhaps missing one stakeholder in that every time a drug is withdrawn from the market, the media whips up a sandstorm, there's a desire for heads to roll in all directions, and the regulators become under huge pressure. Now, if we're going to move to a stage where we allow access to drugs, there's going to be much more uncertainty, and when there's uncertainty, there's going to be inevitably a much greater increase of drugs being pulled off at a later stage. How can we manage this so that it's not regarded as a failure of the system, but perhaps an essential part of what we're trying to achieve?
Comments? Hans-Georg?
So, I agree with you. This is the expected outcome. If you allow something earlier with less evidence, you will probably fail more often. Just as an aside, there was a very critical article in a scientific journal a couple of weeks ago that looked at the conditional approvals. This is very similar to the accelerated approval that you have. And they found that not a single one of those, so the number of N was very small, but not a single had been withdrawn. I find that surprising and positive. But assume this happens. Well, what can we do up front? We don't overpromise. I think that is a mistake that we have sometimes done, and I'm sorry to say that, but one of your pre-commissioners, not the past one, said publicly, we're here to ensure safe drugs for the American people. Well, we know what happened then. Something happened, and it was not so good. So maybe we shouldn't, well, it's bound to happen. So maybe we should never overpromise, but be far more open and say, well, for all we know today, we like to believe the benefits outweigh the risks. We're transparent, we go to patients, we inform them. Maybe that is some kind of damage control. But in the end, if it happens, we will have to manage the communications as well. And I totally agree with Alistair. The press will be there to entertain and not to inform. there will not be one size fits all. It is a problem that we see happening. And with this whole thing of what we call adaptive pathways or early actions, it was perfectly predictable that it will be criticized, and it has been criticized. Some of you may have read, there is a document in Europe circulating now from a group of consumer advocates that say that is about the last thing we need on earth. What we need is tight, high standards, thoroughly researched drugs, and if patients have to wait, all the better, because then they have thoroughly researched products. That is predictable. That will happen again. We have to address it head on.
Sandy?
Yeah, I have similar to the theater analogy. I was in the Bay Area when we were building the new Bay Bridge, and I remember sitting in these really, really long lines trying to get on the new span, and the old span was sitting right there. And you know, July 31st, the old span was being used, and August 1st, I was no longer allowed to use the old span, even though the old span was declared unsafe from earthquake damage for 10 years or 20 years. But all of a sudden, over the course of the night, I wasn't allowed to use the old bridge, and of course, there's no line at the old bridge. And when I think about drugs and drug safety and iterative development, I often thought about when I sat in this long line waiting for the new bridge span so I could get through. Couldn't I just sign something that allowed me to take the old bridge, and I'd still be happy to pay to go on the old bridge, and it would just be my risk, right? I would just take that risk, fly to San Francisco across the old span while everyone else sat in the safe span. And when I think about where we are with innovative drugs and to your point about withdrawal, I don't know if we actually withdraw a lot of medicines. We do withdraw medicines when we find after exposure to large number of patients, those rare events come up that were really unexpected. And sometimes I explain to my family and friends, you know, one of the reasons why people don't know about a drug safety event is because it could be that 100,000 patients take the drug before that first event comes. And when the first event comes, you don't really think it's the event of the drug. So you wait for the second event, and maybe that's 200,000 patients or 300,000 patients. I think what we do see in some of the innovative meds that are being approved and released on some of these more innovative pathways is that you have iterative communication, right? There might be more information that comes in that further restricts the patient population that has access to that medication. There might be further information in the warnings and precautions that advise the prescribers and the patients. So I would hope that when we use the new pathways, it's not a matter of kind of that black or white, is it on the market or off the market, but maybe as the information and evidence is developed, we just further define the correct patient population who has access to that drug.
I think that's absolutely right. We do need to have that kind of graduated approach, and that needs to be consistently put out in communications, because, you know, at the moment, a lot of people, they regard drugs as safe or dangerous, and there's no middle ground between them. And if a drug's not safe, then it's dangerous. But often, you know, drugs will have, well, all drugs will have a risk profile associated with them. But you need to be clear about what terms mean. You know, if you ask, you know, the person on the Clapham omnibus, how many times does something have to happen for it to be quite common or fairly rare or, you know, very rare, you'll get a very different answer from if I ask Hans Georg as a regulator who's got a set of defined criteria. I'm not going to try and second guess what those figures are, but I'm sure you could tell me. And the other thing too is that, you know, even drugs which get withdrawn, I mean, we all know about Vioxx as a drug which was withdrawn because of a very significant safety profile that revealed hazard, you know, serious hazards. But for some people, that drug was a lifesaver, you know. And they said, look, I don't care about the risk of, you know, heart attack or whatever in 20 years' time. I'm not going to live 20 years. And if I do, I'll be grateful to go from a heart attack rather than a, you know, the thing that the Vioxx is working for. So it's about also engaging with the end user and making sure that they're in a position to make a balanced choice about whether they want to run the risk. And I think if people, you know, there have been occasions when patients have gone to the FDA to protest about the withdrawal of a drug because, you know, it gives them a life which they didn't have previously. And that sort of interaction, I think, is going to be an increasing feature of regulatory monitoring of post-marketing use of innovative therapies.
Well, I can see that we're out of time, and I can also see that there are many questions from the audience that unfortunately we didn't have time to answer through the panel, but I want to encourage everybody to find the panelists. They'll be around through the session, and let's have good conversation on this very, very important and complicated topic. In closing, I want to say that, it's a little bit of a downer when you think about what we need to do yet, but we have made tremendous progress over the last several years. And the fact that we're talking about it collaboratively across the stakeholder community, I think, is a real statement of what is yet to come. So thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. And that's it.